On a December evening in the late 1970s, a teenage girl sat at a bus stop in St. Louis, Missouri. Freezing wind whipped against her face, and so she zipped up her old worn-out coat and tried to stop her teeth from chattering. When the bus finally pulled up, the girl didn't get on. She couldn't afford the fare, and she didn't have anywhere to go. And so as the sun set, she curled up on the bus bench, hoping she would just make it through the night without getting frostbite. As she laid there in the cold, she prayed for her life to change. She dreamed of having a good job, a warm bed, and a family that loved her. What she didn't know was that in just a few years, she would have all of those things and more. However, that dream life would turn out to be a nightmare. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. So, if you like today's story, please offer to remodel the Follow Button's home for free, but after you do all the demolition, just abandon the job. This episode is called Mother or Murderer. On July 4th, 1989, 24-year-old Patty Stallings stood on the porch of her home in Hillsborough, Missouri, which is the suburb of St. Louis. She and her husband, 27-year-old David, had recently purchased this house, which overlooked Lake Wawanoka. That night, they could actually see the local Independence Day fireworks show right from their front porch. However, instead of looking up at the fireworks, both of them were just admiring their 4-month-old son, Ryan, who cooed as Patty cradled him in her arms. A sense of gratitude washed over Patty as she locked eyes with her husband. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in just a few short years. As a teenager, she'd lived on the streets, with nothing of her own and no one to protect her. In her early 20s, she had gotten a job at a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, hoping to turn her life around. But things hadn't really changed until 3 years ago, in 1986, when she had met her future husband David, who worked as a professional plate engraver. He and Patty had clicked right away, and they got married in 1988 and were soon able to purchase this dream home, the small lake house with white trim and a nice front porch. Because of her husband, Patty was the happiest she had ever been in her entire life. As the fireworks continued to illuminate the night sky, Patty looked back down at her baby's peaceful face tucked up against her chest. But then, out of nowhere, her baby, Ryan, vomited all over Patty's shirt, way more than how much babies usually spit up. But Patty wasn't too concerned. Ryan had suffered from digestive problems since he was just 2 weeks old, and his doctors had assured her as long as he was gaining weight, he was okay. And Ryan was hitting all of his weight benchmarks, so Patty trusted he would be okay. But still, when Patty went inside to get changed, and also to change the baby, she wanted to make sure Ryan didn't appear sick. He didn't seem fussy or uncomfortable, and he smiled and cooed at her as she changed him into a fresh onesie, and so Patty figured everything must still be fine. So she finished dressing her baby, then she changed her own clothes, and then the pair went back outside to enjoy the rest of the fireworks with David. 5 days later, Patty woke up in her large, sunny bedroom feeling unusually well rested. She rolled over in bed to find the other side was empty. David had already left for work. She checked the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was almost 9 a.m. She'd slept in longer than usual. She listened for the sounds of her son crying for breakfast, but the house was silent. But Patty didn't think much of it. She was actually thankful to have such a nice, quiet, slow morning for once. Patty made her way into the kitchen, she brewed a cup of coffee, and then sat down on the couch. She spent a moment enjoying the peace and quiet, but after a few minutes passed, she started feeling uneasy. It wasn't normal for her baby to sleep this late. And so Patty tiptoed into the nursery, and she found her son lying in his crib, but he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open in a glassy stare. His lips were pressed tightly shut, and his chest rose and fell way too fast, like he was having trouble catching his breath. Patty's stomach dropped. She'd never seen her son look so sick before. She lifted his limp body out of the crib, and almost immediately, Ryan began vomiting almost uncontrollably. Patty was so scared she began shaking. Still carrying her baby, she ran into the living room. She grabbed the phone, But she didn't call 911. She lived far from the hospital and knew that waiting for an ambulance would waste time Ryan probably didn't have. She knew it would be faster just to take him to the hospital herself. So she called the St. Louis Children's Hospital and told the operator she was on her way. "10 minutes later, Patty sped down the highway towards St. Louis. She wasn't familiar with the roads, and driving in the city made her nervous. And so as cars honked and swerved around her, she tried to look down at the paper map in her lap to read it, but it was really hard to do that and also drive. As Patty turned around to check her blind spot, she caught a glimpse of Ryan in his car seat. It looked like his chest was barely moving. Afraid her son was just going to stop breathing altogether, Patty turned back around and just began looking out ahead for any highway sign that might just tell her where to go. Right up ahead, she noticed a sign that had a big H on it right near an exit ramp, and Patty knew that meant there had to be a hospital close by. So she flipped on her blinker, she got off the freeway, and followed the hospital signs towards the emergency room. It wasn't until she pulled into the parking lot of that hospital that she realized it was not the St. Louis Children's Hospital that she had called. The sign on the building that she was at said Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. But really, it didn't matter to Patty. She was just happy to be somewhere with doctors who could help her son. So she turned off her car, she jumped out, and she opened up the back door, and she reached in, and Ryan's tiny body was just so limp in his car seat. Patty unstrapped him carefully and then picked him up and held him tight to her chest. She could barely hear his shallow breathing as she ran with him inside the emergency room. Once she was inside, Patty rushed to the check-in desk and explained what was going on. A young nurse arrived quickly and ushered her and her son into the pediatric intensive care unit. The nurse then took Ryan out of Patty's arms and brought him into an examination room. Patty followed, feeling totally helpless. As Patty walked into the room, she saw her son was already being hooked up to a nasal cannula, which is like a thin tube with two prongs that are inserted into the nose. When they turned it on, it sent oxygen into Ryan's lungs, helping him breathe. Within moments, Patty could see her son's chest was now rising and falling normally, and she was so relieved. As soon as the ER doctor confirmed that yes, Ryan was stable now, Patty asked a nurse to use the hospital phone. She needed to call her husband. Later that day, Patty and her husband David sat by Ryan's bedside, watching him breathe through the tube attached to his nose. After such a frantic morning and afternoon, Patty was totally exhausted, and David, who had left work early to be there, was also very tired. And so as the anxiety of the day began to fade away, because Ryan was very stable at this point, the parents began to nod off. But before they could fall asleep, an older man in a white coat entered the room. He had graying hair and a round, reddish face. He sat down next to the parents and introduced himself as Dr. Stevens, the hospital's chief of pediatrics. Patty couldn't read the doctor's expression. It was like he'd practiced keeping his face totally neutral, most likely so he could deliver any kind of news, good or bad, with some level of professional distance. Dr. Stevens told the parents that their son, Ryan, seemed like he was going to be okay, but he really wasn't sure what had caused their son's illness. He had ordered some blood tests, but it could take days to run them all, and Ryan needed to stay in the hospital until the results were in. Until then, there was really nothing Patty or David could do, and so Dr. Stevens suggested that they go ahead and actually nod off and try to get some rest. 3 days later, on July 12th, Dr. Stevens strode down the hospital hallway, followed closely by two men wearing black suits. The doctor was totally on edge. In his long career as a pediatrician, he'd seen a lot of shocking things, but nothing like this. Dr. Stevens eventually came to a stop outside of a room where he knew Patty and David were staying. Ryan was not in the room with them. This was a room just for the parents. Dr. Stevens turned around and told the two men in suits to please wait in the hall for a second so that he, the doctor, could go in first and speak to the couple. The two men in suits nodded and stayed put, and Dr. Stevens, he took a deep breath, turned around, and then knocked on the door, but then before waiting for an answer, he just opened it up and went inside. Patty and David were sitting on the bed inside the room, looking tired but also hopeful. Dr. Stevens immediately told them that he had good news. Their baby, Ryan, was going to be okay. Dr. Stevens watched relief wash over both parents, and then Patty asked the doctor, when could they see their son? Dr. Stevens paused. He knew what he was about to say next was going to start a very difficult conversation. He explained that Ryan's diagnosis, while not fatal, was still very serious and deeply concerning. According to lab reports, Ryan had high levels of ethylene glycol in his system, and ethylene glycol was one of the main ingredients in antifreeze. It was extremely toxic if consumed, and there was no way a baby of Ryan's age could ingest antifreeze on his own. He couldn't even crawl yet. Dr. Stevens paused to gauge Patty and David's reaction, looking for any signs of guilt or panic, but their faces were blank with confusion. So Dr. Stevens continued, being very careful to keep his tone detached as he made his meaning crystal clear. There is only one way Ryan could have antifreeze in his system, and that would be if someone deliberately fed it to him. In short, he was telling the parents that their child had been intentionally poisoned, and Patty and David were the main suspects. Dr. Stevens watched the parents closely as they finally registered what he was saying. Their eyes went wide and their mouths fell open. He half expected them to begin protesting, but they actually just didn't say anything at all. They just stood there, stunned. Then Dr. Stevens walked over to the door and rested his hand on the doorknob, and then he told the parents that, given the circumstances, he had contacted both the Missouri Division of Family Services and the police. Then Dr. Stevens opened the door to reveal the two men in suits. They were detectives with the St. Louis Police Department, and they were here to interview Patty and David. The little room fell silent as Dr. Stevens watched Patty and David stand up and follow the two detectives down the hallway towards two rooms where each parent would be interviewed separately. 9 days later, Patty stood at her son's bedside in the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Ryan smiled up at her with no breathing tubes in the way. He cooed and grabbed at the air. Patty wanted to reach down and pick him up, but she was too anxious. 2 nurses stood in the corner of the room like guards, watching her every move. When the detectives had interviewed her the previous week, they'd asked her a lot of invasive questions about her marriage and her baby. They kept repeating that either she or her husband must have poisoned Ryan. The whole thing just felt like some sick joke. Patty insisted she was innocent. She had no idea how her son ended up with antifreeze in his system, but she knew she and David were not to blame. The police did eventually let them go, and they'd spent every night at the hospital since then, but still, every time Patty left her room, she could feel the staff looking at her with intense suspicion. Patty turned and made eye contact with one of the nurses standing in the corner of the room. Patty asked if she could hold her baby. The nurse hesitated and then said, "Yes, you can." Patty reached down, but before she could pick Ryan up, Dr. Stevens came into the room. Patty instinctively pulled her arms back. She'd felt like she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though all she really wanted to do was just hold her baby. Dr. Stevens came over to Ryan's bedside and took a look at him. Patty knew her son had been improving, but she was still kind of surprised when Dr. Stevens said Ryan was healthy enough to leave the hospital. Patty broke into a huge smile at this news. She'd been so confused and anxious, but now her son was healthy again. The police hadn't arrested her and her husband. It sounded like everything was going to be okay. But then she saw the doctor's expression shift. He explained that Ryan was being released from the hospital, but he was not going home with Patty and David. The police investigation was still ongoing, and until they knew more, Dr. Stevens had to release Ryan into the custody of the state. Ryan was going to be placed in foster care. Patty was stunned and heartsick. She'd assumed once Ryan got better, they'd be able to move on. But now she realized this problem was going to be much bigger and go on much longer than she'd anticipated. But more than anything else, she was just worried about some stranger taking her baby home. She had no way of knowing if the foster family would actually take good care of him. Patty wanted to scream, but looking at Dr. Stevens' face, she knew it wouldn't make any difference. So she turned away from the doctor and sat down next to Ryan's hospital bed, saying she wouldn't leave his side until she absolutely had to. 6 weeks later, Patty, David, and David's parents arrived at a state-sponsored childcare facility in St. Louis for a visit with baby Ryan. Ever since they'd left the hospital, Patty and her husband had been attending these meetings every Thursday. Patty was excited to see her son, but she was frustrated that the police investigation still was not over. As long as the police were still looking into Ryan's case, she couldn't bring him home. And so the only time she got with her son were these 1-hour-long meetings just once per week. Ryan's foster parents would drop him off at the childcare facility and then pick him up as soon as Patty and David left. To Patty, the whole situation felt ludicrous and backwards, but at the same time, she would much rather spend just an hour with her son each week than no time at all. Patty, David, and David's parents entered the building, and right away, a social worker met them at the door, and she was holding Ryan. Patty's heart leapt when she saw her son. He looked healthy and he smiled as soon as he saw her. Patty reached out and took him from the social worker's arms and carried him down the hallway into a small playroom. The social worker followed the family inside to supervise their visit. For the next hour, Patty, David, and David's parents showered baby Ryan with attention. For Patty, it was bittersweet. They should have been doing these things at their home, not in some facility. When the hour was almost up, David's parents got up to leave. David offered to walk them to their car, and the social worker went along too. They all left the room, and Patty was suddenly alone with her son for the first time in 6 weeks. Suddenly, Ryan began crying. Patty knew he must be hungry, and his foster parents had left a bag for him, so she checked inside of it and found a bottle of formula. She took it out, cradled Ryan in her arms, and began feeding it to him. Patty gazed down at her son, who looked totally content drinking out of his bottle. She held on to hope that she would have him back home soon, and this entire situation would just be over. 3 days after the visit, Patty and David were sitting on their porch looking out across the lake when a police cruiser pulled up in front of their house. 2 officers stepped out, walked up, and announced that they had a warrant. They were there to search their home. Patty could see that her husband was about to protest, but she nudged him, basically saying, "Be quiet, let this happen." At this point, she didn't care what the police did, and the sooner they finished their investigation, the sooner they would realize the parents had done nothing and Ryan could come home. And so while the detectives searched their house, Patty and David just sat together on the porch, not really saying anything. There wasn't anything to say. They both just wanted this to be over. After about an hour, Patty heard the officer's footsteps coming towards the front door. She turned to look at them and saw that they were carrying a large paper bag with the word evidence printed on the front. Before Patty could even say anything, they told her she was under arrest. She stared at them, frozen in shock. Beside her, David stood up out of his chair. He told the officers they can't be serious. But the detectives assured him they were. They said there were a lot of things that Patty and David didn't know. That very morning, Ryan's foster parents had to take him to the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Once again, he was suffering from symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. When police spoke to his foster parents, they learned that Patty had been left alone with him during their last visit, and she had fed him a bottle of formula. Forensic analysts tested the bottle and found traces of antifreeze inside. Plus, the detectives had just discovered an open gallon-sized jug of antifreeze in Patty and David's basement. Patty was floored. She couldn't even process what they'd said about Ryan's bottle and the antifreeze in their basement. She was just too focused on the fact that her baby was sick again and back at the hospital. The police pulled Patty out of her seat and put handcuffs on her wrists. She heard them say she was being charged with assault with a deadly weapon. As they led her towards the police car, she craned her neck backwards and called out to her husband. She begged him to drive up to the hospital. One of them had to be with their son. "4 days after his wife was arrested, David shifted in his chair in the waiting room of the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. For the past 4 days, he'd been living in his own private hell. He couldn't sleep, he barely ate. He could only think about 2 things: his wife being locked up in a jail cell, and his son sick in the hospital. And in fact, Ryan's condition was much worse this time than it was the last time. This time, he was not getting better, and in fact, the doctors had placed him on life support. A few minutes later, Dr. Stevens walked into the room. The doctor's face, which was usually professional and emotionless, was now drawn. David asked what was going on, and Dr. Stevens couldn't help himself, and he just let out this long sigh. Then the doctor explained that despite everything the hospital had tried, his baby Ryan was not getting better. The poison had damaged his organs beyond repair, and there was no chance he would recover. Dr. Stevens told David that if he was religious, that he should think about contacting a minister to baptize his baby Ryan before it was too late. The little boy was very likely not going to make it. These words hit David like a punch. The grief was so immediately overwhelming that he could physically feel it in his chest. But the worst part was, he still didn't understand how this was even happening. David could barely speak, but he managed to whisper out that his wife really needed to be here. Then David just ran to the waiting room payphone, and after calling the jail where Patty was being held, and then also the local courthouse, David ended up talking to the judge in charge of Patty's case. And David begged the judge to please release his wife so she could at least come to the hospital and be with her child during his final moments. David assumed the judge would have at least some sympathy for their situation, so he was surprised when, without the slightest hesitation, the judge said no. He called Patty a baby killer and refused to let her anywhere near her son. At this point, David's grief turned into rage. He slammed the phone down and crumpled into his chair. In the span of only 2 months, his perfect life had fallen apart. But despite what the police and the judge said, he knew Patty was innocent. She adored their son. There had to be a better explanation for what was going on. David took a deep, shuddering breath and then turned to see Dr. Stevens standing there. In a soft voice, the doctor said they needed David's permission to disconnect Ryan from his life support machine. David asked if there was absolutely anything else they could try, but Dr. Stevens just shook his head and said no. And so, with no other options, David did give his permission. That same afternoon, David went into Ryan's room in the intensive care unit, and he choked back tears as a minister baptized his son. And then at around 5 p.m. on September 7th, 1989, David held Ryan as the doctors turned off his life support. David would sit there cradling his baby until his baby slowly passed away. A few hours later, David had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of his entire life. He had to call Patty in jail to tell her that her son was dead. When Patty heard the news, it was like the whole world just faded away. All she could hear was David's voice, explaining how he'd tried to convince the judge to let her come to the hospital, but he'd refused. David swore he'd done everything he could. He was scraping up money from relatives to hire a good lawyer. He promised he would get her out of jail as soon as he could. And then, for at least a full minute, Patty and David just stayed on the phone saying nothing to each other. As the white cinder block walls of the jail's call center came back into focus, Patty saw the guard tap his wrist, letting her know her time was up. Patty told David she had to go, and then she hung up the phone and followed the guard out of the room, feeling totally numb. The next morning, Patty awoke to see a gruff-looking police deputy standing right outside the bars of her cell. He was there to give her even more bad news. Because her son had passed away, her charges were now being upgraded. In addition to assault with a deadly weapon, she was now being accused of first-degree murder. Patty grabbed a pillow and put it over her face. She felt like she'd been dragged into an alternate universe. She just couldn't understand how any of this could be real. The following month, in October, Patty sat on a plastic chair inside of the jail doctor's office. Across from her was a young physician who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now. And frankly, Patty felt the same way. She told the doctor she'd been feeling overwhelmed. Her hair was falling out, she was gaining weight, and she wasn't menstruating. At first, she just assumed that the stress of this horrible situation she was in was making her physically sick. But now, she was beginning to think it actually might be more than that. The doctor did not seem very sympathetic, but he did run a few tests, including collecting blood and urine samples. And while he waited for test results, she went back to her cell. A few hours later, the doctor came by to deliver the news. It turned out Patty was pregnant. 4 months later, in February of 1990, Patty gripped the sides of her hospital bed, her knuckles turning white from the pain of her latest contraction. When she'd gone into labor, she was transferred from the jail to a nearby emergency room. Patty was in a lot of pain from all the contractions, but mostly she was just feeling frustrated and angry because here she was, giving birth to her second child, and her husband was not even allowed to be there. And also, on top of that, she was grieving the loss of her first child. Patty could hear the labor and delivery nurse instructing her to push. And so Patty dug her fingers into the mattress and squeezed her eyes shut, and she felt like her body was going to rip open. And then suddenly she heard the sound of her baby crying. The nurse lifted up the newborn, and with a smile, she announced that it was a boy. Patty softened her grip on the bed. Still out of breath, she said that she and her husband had already decided on a name. David Jr., or DJ for short. Patty reached out for her child, and the nurse handed the baby over to her, and Patty held her newborn son tight against her chest. But her joy only lasted a few moments, because before long, the nurse gave Patty a very sympathetic expression, and then reached in and grabbed DJ, and then took DJ out of the room. Patty had known this was going to happen. She'd been told that, just like Ryan, DJ would be placed directly into state custody. Now she hadn't just lost one child, she'd lost two. Patty rolled over in her bed, sobbing. 2 weeks after giving birth to DJ, Patty sat in the jail's call center with a phone pressed against her ear. David had called to talk to her, and his voice was tight with concern. He said it was about DJ. Patty didn't think she could handle any more bad news, but she asked her husband, what was wrong, and he said DJ's foster parents had to take him to the St. Louis Children's Hospital that morning. Doctors said he was going to be okay, but he was extremely sick. At the thought of her youngest son being in the hospital, just like Ryan had been, Patty felt a knot rise in her throat. She asked David what kind of symptoms DJ had and if the doctors had diagnosed him with anything specific. And as David started listing off all of DJ's issues, Patty had an idea. She told her husband she had to go. She needed to call her lawyer before her phone time was up. David had managed to collect enough money from his family to hire an attorney for Patty. Since then, she and this lawyer had been preparing for her upcoming murder trial. And in her experience so far, the lawyer tended to be very busy and somewhat difficult to reach. Patty dialed her attorney's number. The phone rang so long she was worried he wouldn't answer, but finally he did pick up. But he sounded breathless and overwhelmed as usual. Patty knew this lawyer had a lot of cases to deal with, but for now, she really needed him to listen. Patty had a theory that she thought would prove her innocence, that she never gave Ryan antifreeze. The lawyer listened to this theory and then afterwards promised to do whatever he could. Patty thanked him and then hung up the phone. When she stood up, Patty actually felt pretty good. She was actually looking forward to her trial, which was scheduled for early 1991. It would be her chance to prove her innocence, bring DJ home, and put this horrible series of events in the past. About a year later, in early 1991, so January 31st, David sat in a quiet courtroom gallery, anxiously watching as 12 jurors re-entered the room. After 3 days of trial and 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors had finally reached a verdict on whether or not Patty was guilty of murdering her son Ryan. David tried to stay positive, but honestly, he did not feel very optimistic. The prosecution had been led by a tall, imposing man named George McElroy. He was the lead prosecutor in Jefferson County, Missouri, and he had presented an overwhelming amount of evidence against Patty. The prosecution's witnesses had testified that antifreeze had been found in Ryan's blood twice. The results were confirmed by 2 different laboratories using 2 different diagnostic methods. Plus, analysts had found traces of ethylene glycol in Ryan's bottle, and also an open container of antifreeze inside of David and Patty's house. All through the trial, David had anxiously waited for Patty's lawyer to present Patty's theory, the one she thought could prove her innocence. The lawyer had tried to make an argument for it, but he didn't call an expert witness to testify. So the judge wouldn't allow it into evidence, and the jury wasn't allowed to consider Patty's theory. David had been furious. It wasn't easy to pay for this lawyer, and now he felt like the lawyer had kind of failed, and Patty's defense had been a total disaster. But there was nothing David could do now. The jurors sat down in the courtroom, and the jury foreman approached a microphone. David tapped his foot anxiously as he saw his wife at the front of the room, standing up, getting ready to hear what this foreperson had to say. Then David heard the foreman's voice through the courthouse speakers. But as the foreman read the verdict, it was like David's brain couldn't process what he was hearing. The jury had found Patty guilty of first-degree murder. After the verdict was read, David saw Patty collapse back into her chair. He couldn't see her face from his seat. All he saw were 2 policemen immediately handcuffing her and leading her out of the courtroom. David dropped his head into his hands, feeling a mixture of fury and despair. No matter what the prosecution had said, David did not have a shred of doubt about his wife's innocence. A week later, David was at home when he received a call from Patty's attorney. He was calling about Patty's sentence. She had just been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David was crushed. He hung up the phone and started pacing back and forth across his living room, trying to think of some way he could fix this, but he just couldn't think of anything. 4 months after Patty's trial, in May of 1991, David sat in his living room alone. He looked out the window that faced their front yard, and he remembered that night, almost 2 years ago, when he and his wife were holding Ryan and watching the fireworks. Patty said she couldn't believe how much her life had changed since they had met, and David couldn't believe how much more it had changed since then. Their first child had died, their second child, DJ, was still living with a foster family, and just like when Ryan was in foster care, David was only allowed to visit DJ once a week for 1 hour. But David still hoped he could find a way to bring his family back together. David picked up the remote and turned on the TV and changed the channel to NBC. In just a few minutes, the program he was waiting for would come on. He had promised himself he would find a way to make things right again. Ever since Patty's verdict, he'd been working to get as much publicity as possible. He'd even convinced the producers of a hugely successful television show to cover Patty's story. And as the clock hit 8 p.m., the opening credits of Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, began. David saw his wife's face on the television, followed by pictures of baby Ryan. The narrator began their story, and David leaned back in his chair. He'd done everything he could. Now he just had to hope for the best. At the same time this show was playing, across town, a geneticist and pediatrician named Dr. William Sly sat at home in his easy chair watching the same Unsolved Mysteries broadcast. As he saw pictures of baby Ryan and listened to interviews with Patty, the doctor found himself totally hooked into this story. He also thought he might be able to help David and Patty. Dr. Sly was the chairman of St. Louis University's Department of Biochemistry. When he heard Patty explain her theory of why she was innocent on this show, the same theory her lawyer did not present at her trial, Dr. Sly thought it made sense. And if Patty's theory really was true, then Patty really had been wrongly convicted. The next morning, when Dr. Sly arrived at work at his university laboratory, he pulled one of his colleagues aside, Dr. James Shoemaker, to tell him about Patty's theory. But when Dr. Shoemaker heard Patty's name, he stopped in his tracks. He said he'd heard about the case over a year ago, in April of 1990. He also thought Patty's theory sounded viable, so he'd reached out to one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood. He'd requested copies of all their lab reports, as well as any samples of Ryan's blood that they still had on hand. Back then, Dr. Shoemaker had done his own analysis, and his results didn't exactly match the ones that one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood had come up with. At the time, Dr. Shoemaker didn't know what to do with this information, but he still had all the paperwork in his office. Dr. Sly's heartbeat quickened. He told his colleague he needed to see those lab results right now. The two doctors raced down the hallway to Dr. Shoemaker's office. Dr. Sly anxiously looked on as his colleague rifled through a stack of papers on his desk. Dr. Shoemaker grabbed a few sheets and held them out. Dr. Sly picked up the documents and started scanning through them. And as he compared the original lab results with Dr. Shoemaker's analysis, Dr. Sly's jaw dropped. He asked Dr. Shoemaker for a piece of paper and a pen. He needed to write a letter to the county prosecutor. 4 months later, in September of 1991, County Prosecutor George McElroy stood in front of a huge crowd of reporters and a cameraman. He looked to his right and he saw Patty and David standing beside them. Both of them had totally stoic expressions on their faces. Prosecutor McElroy straightened his jacket nervously. This was the most important and most embarrassing press conference of his career. He leaned close to the microphone and announced that he'd done something unprecedented. He had asked the county circuit judge to dismiss the murder charges against Patty Stallings. He said after reading Dr. Sly's letter and consulting with another independent medical expert, he was finally convinced of Patty's theory. She'd been right all along. Baby Ryan didn't die from antifreeze poisoning. For over 2 years, Patty had been accused of poisoning her son, but she had never hurt him. Nobody had. In reality, Ryan had died from a rare genetic disorder called methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA for short, which caused his own body to produce a deadly chemical that was nearly identical to antifreeze. People with MMA can't fully digest food containing certain proteins and fats, many of which are in breast milk and baby formula. When these nutrients are not properly processed, they break down and turn into poison in the body. This causes vomiting, lethargy, trouble breathing, and organ damage. Patty had told her lawyer that she believed Ryan could have this disorder because his little brother DJ had it too. When DJ had fallen ill, his symptoms were the exact same as Ryan's, but instead of finding antifreeze in his blood, DJ's doctors had found a toxic substance called propionic acid. Propionic acid is often a telltale sign of MMA. It's also almost chemically identical to ethylene glycol, which is the poison found in antifreeze. The molecules are only different by a few carbon atoms, and so the two are easily mistaken for each other. When Dr. Sly saw Ryan's case on Unsolved Mysteries and then looked over the baby's lab results, this was the tiny discrepancy he found. The substance that analysts thought was ethylene glycol was actually propionic acid. Tragically, if Ryan had been treated at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where DJ had been correctly diagnosed and Patty was trying to take Ryan when he first got sick, all of this could have been avoided. Instead, the analysts at Cardinal Glennon and the other labs that tested Ryan's blood had unfortunately misidentified this naturally occurring substance as antifreeze, and their incorrect findings had been used to send Patty, an innocent woman, to prison for life. It is worth noting that the mix-up in going to the wrong hospital would not have necessarily saved Ryan because MMA has an extremely high mortality rate and long-term survival is not very likely. As prosecutor George McElroy stood before the crowd of reporters, he admitted he'd been wrong, and then he personally apologized to Patty and David. He said even though their suffering could not be undone, he would make sure Patty was fully exonerated and she would get to bring her surviving son, DJ, back home. Patty and David filed lawsuits against the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, the diagnostic labs who'd misdiagnosed Ryan, and 3 different physicians. In 1993, they received an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount. Their surviving son, DJ, battled the same genetic disorder that killed his brother, and unfortunately, it took his life too in 2013, when he was just 23 years old. On the afternoon of September 29, 1988, a 10-year-old boy named Francisco was walking along the perimeter of a man-made lake in southern Brazil while poking the ground with his stick. Francisco was doing one of his favorite after-school activities, which was looking for bugs. And this lake, which was a part of the Billings Reservoir in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, was his favorite place to do that. And the reservoir was gigantic, but it was not shaped like a typical circular lake. Instead, it was more like a big river that kind of wound around and had all these skinny branches kind of jutting off the sides of it. And on this particular day, Francisco was walking along one of those skinny offshoots of this lake, where at certain points, if Francisco wanted to, he could literally swim to the other side of the lake in a matter of minutes. Now, Francisco knew he was not really supposed to be anywhere near this reservoir, because in recent years, gangs from the nearby cities would bring their murder victims out to this reservoir and bury them here. And so locals knew it was not a safe place and to stay clear. But Francisco, he didn't listen to any of that because he loved walking around this lake and looking for bugs. And so he thought, you know what? No one's harmed me yet, so what's the big deal? And so, as Francisco casually walked along, poking at the mud, looking for his bugs, he finally saw one. It was a huge water scorpion, almost 2 inches long, and so immediately Francisco, without taking his eyes off the bug, drops his backpack, grabs a clear container that he kept in the side pocket, he opened it up, he bent down, and he scooped up this water scorpion and capped it, and then he brought the container up and looked inside to kind of admire his new pet. And as he was staring at this container, he noticed something odd on the other side of the lake. He basically saw it through the plastic container. And so he lowered the container to get a better look at this strange thing on the other side of the water. And what he saw was this big group of vultures, all kind of standing in a circle right on the water's edge. And immediately, Francisco was way more interested in these vultures than in his bug, because vultures meant there had to be a dead thing nearby, because vultures are scavengers. And so whatever they were circled around was probably a dead animal. But Francisco, he looked around and realized there was no way to get to the other side of the water to see whatever this dead thing was unless he swam. And he knew if he went back home with soaking wet clothes, his mom would know he had snuck to the reservoir and he'd be in lots of trouble. And so, feeling really frustrated, Francisco just picked up a rock and chucked it to the other side, trying to splash the water near the vultures to get them to fly away so he could see the dead thing. But the first rock he threw did not really have an effect. The vultures just kind of turned around and looked at him and then went back to whatever was on the ground. And so Francisco gathered a big pile of like 25 rocks and began throwing them one after the other at these vultures. And finally, Francisco had caused enough chaos on the other side of the water that the vultures got upset and they took to the air and they flew away. And finally, Francisco got a clear view of the dead thing that was in the middle of the circle of vultures. Now, initially, Francisco thought this dead thing was going to be maybe a bird or some other small animal from the area, but when he got a good look at this dead thing from 30 feet away, it didn't look like either of those things. It didn't have fur, it didn't have feathers, it actually looked kind of pale, almost like a pig. But Francisco's thinking to himself, why would a pig be all the way out here? And then it slowly dawned on Francisco that what he was looking at was actually a dead person. Suddenly terrified, Francisco scooped up his things, turned around, and ran to the nearest village where he began screaming for help. Within a few hours, the area along the water where the vultures had been and where this body was swarming with police and also with curious villagers. Normally, when a body was discovered in or near this reservoir, which unfortunately happened quite a bit because of all the recent gang violence, police would often break ranks from the investigation and walk over to the local onlookers and kind of fill them in and tell them, who this person was and what they think happened. But this time it was totally different. The police were totally secretive and it was really obvious. The police immediately roped off the entire area with crime scene tape, and then the police officers stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, blocking the view of the villagers so they couldn't see the body. And then when villagers actually walked up to police and said, hey, can you tell us what's going on? The police would say they couldn't talk about it, and then they would tell the villagers to back up and stay away. Locals would stick around for a while, being treated this way the entire time by police, and then finally when the sun started to go down and it was clear the police were very committed to hiding what was going on, whoever was still there finally just left, figuring when they got home, they could just turn on the news and see what had happened with this dead person. But when they got home and turned on their TV, there was not one news story about this body. And at a minimum, this story should have dominated local news, but it somehow was not being talked about. And then even stranger was the next morning when locals got up, they headed back to the reservoir to see what the police were up to, and when they got there, they found the police were gone, the body was gone, and there was absolutely no trace that anyone or anything had ever been there. It was like it had been totally sanitized. For days, locals in this area continued to check the TV news, they checked the radio, the newspapers for some story, some bit of information about this dead body that was found. But again, there was just absolutely nothing, and it just made no sense. Why wasn't anyone talking about this? And so eventually, in the absence of any official information about what happened, a rumor began to circulate among locals that the body belonged to a local fisherman who had gone missing 3 days before Francisco discovered him. And this fisherman, apparently he was an alcoholic, and he had gone to the reservoir and he had begun drinking, and apparently he drank so much that it killed him. Now, many people wondered, if this drunk fisherman story was the real story, then why were the police so secretive about the body, and why weren't they willing to give up any information to the crowd about what had happened to this guy? I mean, a drunk fisherman is not a super sensitive thing. It just seemed like that doesn't line up with the police's behavior. But questions like these remained unanswered, and after several weeks of still no new information, no news coverage anywhere, even the most skeptical of villagers who really thought there's something weird going on here, they just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 6 years later, in 1994, when someone, we don't know who, from the Brazilian government decided they just couldn't keep the secret any longer. And so they gathered up some photos and an autopsy report they were not supposed to have, and they smuggled those things to the media. And once the media published these things, it became immediately clear that the dead man who was found in the reservoir in 1988 was not a drunk fisherman who drank himself to death, nor was he the victim of gang violence. Instead, it appeared that this person's death could potentially be paranormal. But before we dive into the significance of those leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report, you need to understand a weird aspect of Brazil's history. Brazil has an absolutely astounding number of sightings of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs for short. And these are not your typical UFO stories where some person claims they saw aliens or they were abducted by aliens, but they have no witnesses, they have no proof, they have nothing but their own story. No, in Brazil, the bulk of their UFO sightings are reported by their military, because Brazil actually has a government program to monitor UFO sightings because it happens so much in their country. In fact, the Brazilian government was directly involved in one of the most famous UFO sightings of all time. It was called the Night of the UFOs. This famous sighting, or sightings, because it actually happened in 4 different Brazilian states simultaneously, happened on May 19th, 1986, which was 2 years before Francisco spotted the dead body in the reservoir. On that 1986 day, at around 8:15 p.m., an air traffic controller at an international airport in Sao Paulo noticed 3 red lights hovering over the airport, and so the controller called it in and asked, what are these things? But nobody knew. And at the exact same time, all across Brazil, dozens and dozens of other people who have no idea what's happening at this international airport began reporting that they too were seeing strange lights in the sky. And many of these reports of these lights were coming from military personnel and government officials. And so this was like a really big deal that all across Brazil, everybody's seeing lights in the sky. And so the government, in response to this, scrambled their fighter jets and sent the jets up to try to intercept one of these sets of lights, just to see who or what they were and potentially shoot them down if they had to. But when these jets got anywhere close to these unidentified flying objects, these lights in the sky, these UFOs would move away instantly. One UFO was observed suddenly disappearing and then reappearing 20 miles away in just 5 seconds, which meant that UFO had to travel at least 5 times the speed of sound to cover that distance in such a short amount of time. For reference, humans are not capable of going that fast. We cannot do that. Eventually, the night of the UFOs ended when all these UFOs, these lights in the sky, just kind of suddenly vanished. And then a couple of days later, the Brazilian government held this big press conference about the event, and they would say, we have no idea what those lights were or where they came from. We have no clue. However, whoever or whatever was controlling these UFOs showed obvious signs of intelligence. Now, as mind-blowing as that would be to hear that potentially intelligent creatures are flying around your airspace, remember, this is Brazil, where UFO sightings were kind of the norm, and so people were definitely shocked by this. This was a terrifying thing, but they just kind of accepted what they were told and assumed, the government will handle this, and people moved on with their lives. That is, until several years later in 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report of the dead person in the reservoir were leaked, and then suddenly the people of Brazil, they're seeing this stuff and they're realizing, wait a minute, the night of the UFOs may not have been an isolated instance. Those UFOs may never have left. Here is what the public learned from the leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report. Back in 1988, when little Francisco spotted the dead body from the other side of the water, he correctly identified that it was a man's body. But Francisco had been wrong when he told authorities that it didn't look like this guy had any visible injuries on him. And the guy was naked, and so Francisco felt pretty confident that he would have seen something if the guy was wounded. But when the police arrived and they saw the body up close, they immediately saw he had several very serious and very strange physical injuries. He had these 4 perfectly circular 1 to 1.5 inch diameter holes drilled into his body. There were 2 right above his chest, basically sitting above his armpit. There was one that was right over his belly button, so his belly button was gone. It was just a hole where it had been. And there was also one in his crotch. And these holes were not crudely done. These were done with surgical precision, almost like whoever had done it was using high-end medical tools to make these cuts. Now, at first glance, the authorities had no idea why these holes were on this guy's body. But when the autopsy was done, they discovered this man was missing the majority of his internal organs, and after doing some investigating, they discovered that all of his organs had literally been vacuumed out of him through these holes on his body. Those holes were basically just ports to pull things out of him. Also, most of the man's blood had been suctioned out of those holes as well. But that wasn't all. The man also had one of his ears removed, one of his eyes was removed, and the lower part of his face was also removed. And again, all of these cuts looked like they had been made with absolute surgical precision. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of all the things that came to light when these documents were leaked was something that, unless you looked really closely at the autopsy report, you wouldn't necessarily notice. And it had to do with this man's vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve is something that controls part of your nervous system that's responsible for automatic functions like heart rate and digestion. And so when your body is suddenly in great distress, like suddenly you're fighting for your life or something, your vagus nerve can basically shut off those automatic functions like digestion in order to ensure all your energy is going towards fighting for your life. But in this dead man's case, his autopsy revealed that his vagus nerve had gone absolutely wild right at the moment of his death. It's complicated, but this suggests that this man was very likely alive when his face was being surgically cut off, and those holes were being drilled into his body, and his organs were being vacuumed out. And then at some point, the excruciating pain that came from these horrible things happening to him got so bad, his vagus nerve basically turned off his heart. So it was not these horrible physical injuries that killed him. He literally died from the pain of these physical injuries. In short, his body basically killed itself to avoid feeling the pain it was feeling. So, I'm sure you're wondering, how does the dead man in the reservoir and these leaked photos and the autopsy report, how does all of that connect with the night of the UFOs, which happened 2 years before the man in the reservoir was even found? Well, following the night of the UFOs in 1986, farmers in Brazil who lived in the areas where these famous sightings took place began reporting that their cattle were dying kind of inexplicably. And this began happening with enough frequency in all of these areas where the UFO sightings had taken place that a theory began to develop in Brazil that maybe the UFOs that were here during the night of the UFOs have something to do with all these cows turning up dead. And as that theory began to take hold all across Brazil that, UFOs are killing our cattle, another theory began to come out of that one, which was, well, if the UFOs are coming in here and killing cattle, what's stopping them from killing people? And then in 1988, so 2 years after the night of the UFOs, and right in the middle of all these farmers all across Brazil saying their cows were dying for no reason, the dead man in the reservoir was discovered. And as soon as the government saw the physical condition this guy was in, with the weird holes drilled in his body and his organs missing and his face pulled off, that, plus the fact that he was located in this reservoir, which by the way was in a night of the UFO sighting area, the government decided they would have to hide the story. A critical detail that I have left out intentionally until right now is that the cattle who were turning up dead, they were turning up dead with circular holes drilled into their bodies, with organs missing and parts of their faces removed. Meaning, clearly, whatever was happening to these cattle inside of these sighting areas had happened to this man in the reservoir. And if that got out to the public, then it would confirm for many people in Brazil that, yep, the UFOs, they're the ones going after the cattle, and now they're going after us too. And so this was why the police were so secretive about the body and not letting anybody see it or learn anything about it. And it was also why no news was run anywhere in Brazil about this story. It's because the government was really trying to make sure it did not get out. And the government was able to keep it quiet until 1994 when those photos and the autopsy report were leaked. But like all things having to do with UFOs or aliens or paranormal stuff, it's like despite the evidence, those things very quickly are pushed into the kind of conspiracy theory bucket and they stay there. People do not want to touch that category. So even though Brazil remains an absolute hotbed for UFO sightings, Wikipedia even has a page dedicated just to tracking Brazilian UFO sightings. Despite all that, no one really cares. But if you care, there is an unbelievable amount of information online about what's going on in Brazil, and if nothing else, it is just a fascinating rabbit hole to fall into. The next and final story of today's episode is called Jelly. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski, who just went by Ziggy, was having a late lunch with his wife and his cousin inside of Ziggy's little brick house in the English village of Tingley. That day had been a particularly stressful day for Ziggy and his family because the following day was Ziggy's goddaughter's wedding, and Ziggy was very close with his goddaughter. Ziggy and his wife couldn't have kids because of medical issues, and so his goddaughter had basically become, at least in Ziggy's mind, like his own daughter. And so in fact, at her wedding, Ziggy was going to be walking her down the aisle. And while Ziggy was really excited about this, he was also very stressed out that he was going to screw it up. And so he had gone over and over, what responsibilities he had as part of the wedding party. And he had this little speech he had to give that he had rehearsed 50 times. He had it written out. I mean, he was ready, but he was very much in his own head about something potentially going wrong that he would be responsible for. And on top of that stress, Ziggy had gotten into a fight that day with his cousin because he felt like the cousin was being kind of disrespectful in some way to his goddaughter. And so Ziggy had stepped up and defended his goddaughter to his cousin. And so there was this undercurrent of tension at the lunch table, not to mention this overarching stress that Ziggy was under about this wedding. And so as Ziggy and his cousin and his wife have this kind of tense meal, Ziggy suddenly realizes that he forgot to get potatoes when he went to the store earlier to buy ingredients for this meal. And for some reason, Ziggy decides, you know what? I'm going to just put my stuff down now, go to the store and get those potatoes, even though at this point it was too late to make the potatoes for the meal. And so maybe Ziggy just wanted to go out and do anything to get away from his cousin for a minute and away from all this wedding planning they were doing and just kind of go out and clear his head. And so Ziggy put his napkin down on the table. He stood up. He told his cousin and wife that he was going out to get potatoes. They were like, okay. And the cousin actually said, do you want me to come with you? Is there anything else you need to get while you're out? And Ziggy said, nope, I'm good. He grabbed some cash out of his wallet and he headed out the door. The village of Tingley, where Ziggy and his wife lived, was a very safe place. He and his wife had actually moved there after fleeing from Poland during World War II, where both Ziggy and his wife, whose name was Lottie, had been held prisoner at some point. And so after all this trauma of being held prisoner and having to flee their home country, they had looked for the safest, best place to kind of resettle and stay for good, and Tingley was it, and they loved it. Ziggy had gotten a job in Tingley as a coal miner, and he had been doing that for 27 years. As for Lottie, she didn't work because she had a disease called multiple sclerosis, which meant she was confined to a wheelchair. But Ziggy and Lottie had quickly made lots of friends in town who were very supportive, and so it wasn't long before Ziggy and Lottie had a very happy and stable life in this town. The little shop where Ziggy was going to was only about 3 blocks away from his house, which meant walking to the store, getting potatoes, and coming back would only take a few minutes. And so Lottie and the cousin back home, they expected to see Ziggy really come back within 10-15 minutes. But when he didn't, and after about 30 minutes went by, Lottie actually got really concerned because Ziggy was just not the type of person to do stuff unannounced. He was incredibly methodical, he was very punctual and reliable, and so being late from this little trip to the store was just so uncharacteristic that Lottie told the cousin, hey, you go to the store and see if Ziggy is there, see what's going on here. Ziggy had worked in the coal mine for nearly 30 years, and he had some serious lung issues from breathing in all of the coal, and so Lottie was thinking, maybe he collapsed or something along the way from these breathing issues. But when the cousin got to the shop owner told the cousin that they had seen Ziggy. He had come in about 25 minutes earlier, he had bought a bag of potatoes, seemed totally normal, everything was fine, and he had left, walking back in the direction of his home. And so the cousin thanked the shopkeeper and then left and began jogging back towards Ziggy's house, thinking, maybe he had just not seen him on the way, that maybe Ziggy was sitting down somewhere on this 3-block path. But the cousin got all the way home and didn't see any sign of Ziggy. And so after going back inside of the house, the cousin and Lottie talked about what they should do, and they actually went back out into the neighborhood asking around, asking neighbors and other people if they had seen Ziggy. But after a couple of hours of canvassing the neighborhood and not finding Ziggy or finding any indication of what happened to him, Lottie ended up calling the police. But the police were not inclined to launch a huge investigation for a grown man who's only been missing for a couple of hours in his neighborhood with no sign of foul play or any other sign that anything really bad had happened. And after the police began asking questions of Lottie and the neighbors about what Ziggy's life was like, they learned that recently Ziggy had been declined for an early retirement from the coal mine. Because of those breathing issues he was having, he had requested to retire now, but they said no. And so Ziggy was really upset about that. He was really stressed about this wedding of his goddaughter the next day. He had been fighting with his cousin. Also, Ziggy was basically taking care of his wife, who's in this wheelchair all the time. And so because of all these stressors in Ziggy's life, the police started to wonder if maybe it was possible that Ziggy had not been going to get potatoes, but in fact was just kind of abandoning his family. And so ultimately, on the day that Ziggy went missing, the police told Lottie and Ziggy's cousin that they should just sit tight, see if he comes back tonight, and if he doesn't, go to the wedding tomorrow because Ziggy is so close with the goddaughter. If he's having some sort of issue right now, he's very likely to come back for something as significant as this wedding. And so Lottie and Ziggy's cousin stayed at the house all night. Ziggy did not come back. They didn't hear from him. And the next day they went to the wedding, but Ziggy didn't show up for that either, even though he's supposed to walk his goddaughter down the aisle. And so after coming back from this wedding, Lottie called the police, she called local hospitals, she talked to all of her neighbors. I mean, she really put out like an all-points bulletin to everybody in the area that something terrible has happened to Ziggy and we need to find him. But despite police beginning to lean into this and her neighbors really going out in force to try to find Ziggy, no one could find him. He had just vanished. On the morning of June 11th, so 5 days after Ziggy went to get potatoes and then vanished, a man named Trevor Parker got to work at his father's coal yard in the English town of Todmorden. The coal yard was basically just this big open lot that had a chain link fence around it that butted up against some railroad tracks. And inside of this lot were just these huge mounds of coal up against the perimeter of the lot. And then also inside of the coal yard was one small office building. And so on this morning, when Trevor pulled through the gates of this coal yard, first of all, he could see the entire yard the second he went in. And as he looked out, all he noticed was the fact that everything was wet from an early morning storm. And so after just kind of surveying around the lot to make sure none of the coal got blown around from the storm, he made his way to the small office building to do some paperwork. Trevor would work inside of that office building for a while, and then around lunchtime, Trevor decided to just go and get some lunch and kind of have a nice long lunch break. And so he left, he went to the pub, he was there for a couple of hours, and then around 3:45 p.m., he came back to the coal yard, and when he went through the gates, everything looked the same, except there was this dark thing on top of one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Now, Trevor didn't know if he had seen it when he had first arrived that morning or if it was new, but whatever it was on this pile, it immediately caught Trevor's attention. And so after parking his vehicle, Trevor began walking over to this 12-foot-tall coal pile with this thing on it, and when he got about 30 feet away from it, he realized he saw someone's shoe, that this dark figure was a person, and right away Trevor started rolling his eyes, because there was a group of homeless people that lived near the railroad tracks just outside of the coal yard, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get really drunk and then wander their way into the coal yard, where sometimes they would fall asleep. And so Trevor's thinking, okay, clearly one of these drunk homeless people has found their way into the coal yard and they've passed out on top of this pile of coal. And so instead of going over and talking to this person directly, Trevor just turned around, went back inside of the office building, and he called for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. They did not have their sirens on. They didn't come flying into the yard. This was a routine thing they were doing. They were scooping up a drunk and bringing them back to the hospital. When the medics got out of their ambulance and Trevor directed them over to the proper coal pile, they were just cracking jokes along the way. This was not a big deal. When the two medics got to the bottom of the coal pile, one of them began climbing up the coal to go see this drunk person and get them down. And so Trevor, as this is happening, he walked a little bit closer, and when he did, he realized that the person who had fallen asleep on the coal, they had really nice pants on, like tailored pants. They were certainly not what Trevor expected this person to be wearing. But before Trevor could even really react to the clothes this person had on, the medic who had climbed up had finally reached this person. They reached down and began trying to move the person around. And suddenly, when they had manipulated this person's body enough, the medic's facial expression completely changed. They went from somewhat routine to totally horrified, and they backed off of this person on the coals. They turned around and ran down the coal, practically falling over themselves. And when they got down there, Trevor heard the medic say to his partner, call the police right now. And Trevor said, what's going on? What did you see? And the medic who had reacted that way just shook his head and walked away to kind of compose himself. And so Trevor at this point was starting to get spooked himself. Clearly, whatever the medic had just seen had really shaken him up, and so Trevor just kind of stood there while the other medic ran in and called police. And then a few minutes later, a police car came flying into the coal yard, and an officer named Alan Godfrey, along with his partner, got out of the car, and right away, the medic, who had gone to the top of the pile and been freaked out by what he saw, walked over with a very ashen face, and he told Alan Godfrey that something was terribly wrong with the person on top of this pile. And so Alan, not really sure what to expect, walked over with his partner to this coal pile, and with the medics and Trevor standing back, Alan, on his own, climbed up the coal, and he looked down at this person. And what Alan saw was a man lying on his stomach wearing a beautiful three-piece brown suit, and Alan immediately noticed that there was absolutely no soot from the coal that this guy was laying on his suit, even though Alan, just to get up here, had basically covered himself in black soot. And so he was wondering, how did this guy get up here and not get covered in soot? It didn't make any sense. Also, Alan noticed that this guy's hair looked totally bizarre. It looked like someone had given him like a really bad haircut with dull scissors, like they just grabbed tufts of his hair and kind of chopped randomly. I mean, his hair was kind of all over the place. There were bald spots. And then as Alan looked from this guy's hair down, he noticed almost hidden in his hairline was this fairly deep wound in the back of his neck that was still bleeding. But there was this weird green jelly-like substance very obviously placed over this wound. And Alan had no idea what this substance was. But as weird as all that was, that didn't explain why the first medic had basically completely panicked and run away. When Allen tried to roll this guy over onto his back to try to wake him up and see if he was okay, he rolled him over and Allen got a look at this guy's face. And immediately Allen let go of him and kind of had to step back for a second because the guy's face was contorted in this frozen look of absolute terror. His jaw was open so wide, it was almost like his lower jaw was dislocated, and his teeth were baring, and his eyes were bulging out of his head. And so Allen quickly realized that obviously this was not just some drunk homeless person who passed out here. This was a dead person, and whatever happened to them must have been unbelievably terrifying to leave someone looking like that in their death pose. It would turn out this deceased man in the coal yard was Ziggy Adamski. But this did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ziggy 5 days earlier. In fact, his discovery really only created more questions. This town where this coal yard was, Todmorden, was located 25 miles away from where Ziggy lived. And as far as anyone knew, Ziggy didn't know anybody in Todmorden. So there was no reason for him to be there. And number two, when he had left to go get potatoes, he had been on foot. So did he walk 25 miles to this random town? Also, assuming he did just walk to this coal yard is a big, wide open lot that if you were standing anywhere near it, even outside the fence, you could look in and basically see the entire place. So it just seemed really unlikely that Ziggy could just walk into this very public open space and get to the top of one of these coal piles without somebody noticing him. Whether that was Trevor or one of the other employees that were there, or one of the truck drivers that were in and out of there all the time, all day, doing deliveries, or the homeless people who were near the railroad tracks, or the people who rode the trains that passed by there every single day. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on this coal yard, but nobody saw Ziggy. It was like he just kind of appeared at the top of this pile. And again, even if Ziggy had managed to slip in and sneak to the top of this pile, why didn't he have soot from the coal all over his clothes? And if maybe he had been brought there, if someone had killed him and put him on this coal pile, there's even more reason he would have soot all over him because they would have had to drag him up to the top of the pile. And even putting all of that aside, if someone really did kill Ziggy and they placed him on this pile, why? This is a very open public place. Someone is going to find him. You're going to get caught if you're the killer. And then, of course, there is the issue of what Ziggy was wearing. That brown three-piece suit he was wearing that had no soot on it, it wasn't his. And it wasn't put on right. The buttons were not lined up. It almost looked like somebody else who didn't know how to put a suit on had tried to dress Ziggy. And then Ziggy also did not have an undershirt on. It was just the jacket over his skin. And then also Ziggy had this totally bizarre haircut that looked like someone who didn't know how to give a haircut had cut his hair with scissors and said, good enough. And then of course you have this wound on the back of Ziggy's neck. Now, the wound itself was determined not to be fatal. It was a fairly deep cut, but it wouldn't have killed him. However, the most significant part of that wound was that green jelly that had been placed across the back of it. During Ziggy's autopsy, they were unable to figure out what this green jelly was, and they ran dozens and dozens of tests on it. And also, during the autopsy, the coroner would determine that Ziggy had actually died the same day he had been found. So he was doing something for 5 days between going missing and being on this coal pile, but nobody knows what it was. And as for his cause of death, the coroner was not entirely sure, but it did seem like he died of a heart attack. The coroner would search all of Ziggy's body for signs of some sort of fight he might have gotten into, some sort of defensive wound on his body, but there was nothing. However, the coroner did find there were very small burns on the back of his neck that were caused by acid, but it was unclear how those got there. When they inspected Ziggy's stomach, they determined that he had been eating and drinking regularly, and so he was not malnourished, he was not dehydrated, he was relatively healthy when he died. He just had this heart attack for unknown reasons, and apparently whatever gave him the heart attack scared him so badly, his face contorted in that horrible way. Ultimately, the coroner just kind of gave up and ruled that Ziggy had died of natural causes, and then the case was closed. But to this day, no one really has any idea how Ziggy went from going out to get groceries to winding up 25 miles away, dressed differently, with this haircut, with this jelly on him and acid burns, dead with this horrible look on his face on this coal pile. It doesn't make any sense. This case has become very famous because people say it is the best example of alien abduction. That Ziggy had left his house to get groceries, got abducted by aliens, and then over 5 days, these aliens did stuff to Ziggy, including cutting into his neck and dropping acid on him, and then they put that green stuff on the back of his neck, they dressed him the way they thought people dressed in the suit, but they didn't really do it right, and then they literally just dropped him on top of this coal pile, which would explain why he didn't have soot all over him. He was dead, they dropped him, and he just landed on the top of the coal pile. And even if you think that's totally far-fetched, keep in mind, still today, we do not know what that green jelly compound was on the back of his neck. It's literally never been identified, and people have been trying to figure it out for 40 plus years. Also, it's worth noting that one of the responding police officers, Alan Godfrey, claimed to have seen a UFO within weeks of finding Ziggy Adamski.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.